Now get an update on ISIS and look at the rise of this group with Na'eem Jeenah. He's the Executive Director at the Afro-Middle East Centre. Thank you so much, Na'eem, for making the time to join us. Now, Africa again has seen terror back in the headlines with the recent developments at Garissa University in Kenya, but we're also noting more frequency and in other regions of the continent as well. Allow me to take a step back and ask you just to paint us a picture of where exactly are we finding the terror hotspots, if I may call them that, on the continent, and which groups are operational where?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the continent, certainly Kenya linked to Somalia, of course, because of the role of the Kenyan army in Somalia. There have been now a few attacks in Kenya that have taken place, and so that kind of East African area, the Horn of Africa area, certainly is one of those hotspots. With Al-Shabaab, which is a long story and goes back a few decades, of course, with Somalia. Then in North Africa, more recently, of course, with the uprisings that took place from the end of 2010, we found that with the instability that was created, and instability is not always a bad thing, but part of what came about as a result of the instability was the rise of some groups that previously had been dormant, not active, etc. And you're finding, for example, a number of operations taking place in the Sinai part of Egypt. As with many of these cases, the story in the Sinai is a part of the population that has been forgotten, marginalized, not provided with services, etc. And with the unstable state after the uprisings that took place, many of them in that area then found the opportunity to press for greater delivery of services and all of that, and so you're finding a number of attacks taking place, the army responding there, that kind of thing. Of course, Nigeria, Boko Haram is the other kind of big story on the continent, and we wait to see now what happens with the new president, whether he's going to take a strong line, crush the organization, or what's going to happen. But also in that kind of region, the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. We also had other groups coming out, for example, in Mali. Again, in Mali, much of the activity there was from the Tuareg population, which has had long-standing grievances going back decades because of their marginalization, etc. You know, one that we kind of forget about often is the Lord's Resistance Army, now much weaker than it used to be, but used to be the most brutal group on the African continent, child mutilation, all of that kind of thing, operating in East Africa as well, Uganda and that part of the continent.
Now, if we were to look at the evolution of the modus operandi that terrorist groups are using on the continent, are there specific trends that we can pick up? And has the modus operandi evolved with time? In particular, as you talk about the Lord's Resistance Army and how their strength has somewhat weakened, those that have gained strength, what is it that they're doing differently from the other groups?
I'm not sure that it's because they're doing things differently, and I'm not sure that there are necessarily kind of trends. Most of these groups operate either nationally or regionally. So Lord's Resistance Army, not just in one country, for example, 2 or 3 different countries, and they don't necessarily have a continent-wide agenda or field of operations. Groups in the DRC we've seen. So the agendas usually are national or span 1 or 2 countries. I'm not sure that we can easily point to trends that kind of characterize all of them, but certainly violent action, often targeting civilians, not all of them all the time, but often targeting civilians. Some of them operating in particular parts of their country. Boko Haram really only operating in the north, because that's where they want to kind of take control, the north of Nigeria. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, their kind of tactic has more been kidnapping and crime than anything else.
So no commonalities in terms of modus operandi. If we go back to the root causes, I mean, you've mentioned the word marginalization more than once, and of course described a lot of these areas or affected areas as unstable politically anyway, and where we've seen some sort of transition either into stability or out of stability. Can we then begin to draw or paint a specific picture about the kind of areas that are most likely to be affected by terror on the continent, which might give us a step ahead into what creates vulnerability?
Yes, so two things around that. One is that the ground becomes fertile and good environment is provided in areas where populations are have grievances, feel marginalized, whether it's true or not. They have a perception of being marginalized and not getting the full benefits from the state or the community or whatever that they feel that they should. So in Nigeria, for example, Nigeria is a very stable country. But in the northern part of Nigeria, the population there feels that they're marginalized, and that allows the ground for Boko Haram to emerge. So it's in order to deal with terrorist activity, really the starting point should be the grievances that people have and marginalization that they have. The second one, of course, is that it's most likely or easiest to happen in places where there's instability. So 5 years ago you wouldn't have thought that there'd be terrorist groups operating in Libya, for example, because it was such a repressive society, but in its repressiveness it was stable. Right? But now you have ISIS operating there, people getting killed, etc. So in those countries where there's instability, Libya, Somalia, etc., it's obviously easier to operate.
We're picking up reports that there is a potential collaboration among some of these terror groups, in particular ISIS, potentially coming together with Boko Haram. Others are dismissing this as just a sensationalist ways of making headlines. Should we be paying more attention?
We should always be paying attention to the possibilities of collaboration. I don't think that at the moment there are the kinds of linkages and networks that some people are pointing to. So there's attempts to paint the whole African continent as being riddled by a kind of common terrorist group that is well networked and shares intelligence. I mean, that's not true. So the potential is always there as groups might expand their horizons or their agendas, but I don't think that is the case at the moment. A group like ISIS, though, does have a wing, if you like, in Libya. So that's on the continent, and we know that is the case. The link with Boko Haram is not as clear. Boko Haram seems to indicate at some points an allegiance to ISIS, but it's not really a connection.
Let's look at ISIS in a little bit more depth, and in particular look at infiltration. I mean, we speak about an African presence in Libya. How easy is it to penetrate different markets and begin to spread your presence into those markets?
You make it sound like terrorist groups or businesses. Maybe they are.
Maybe the business of terror.
ISIS is very rich. No, it's again, if there's instability, it's easier. If there's grievances that people have, it's easier to operate, to recruit, to conduct operations without being exposed to authorities, etc. So the market, if you like, in those countries certainly is available.
Let's talk about very quickly before I let you go, the political will to take on terror. It's very recent in my mind when we saw the terror attacks in Paris, and we saw how the European and North American leaders came out in full force and in fact marched against that terror attack. Does the African life seem to matter as much as European lives? Because it certainly seems from the perception of Africans who are not seeing the same level of reaction from their political leaders that African lives don't matter.
Well, I think African lives matter less to Europeans and North Americans, but they should be mattering much more to they should matter much more to Africans and African leaders. And I think that even we have become a little immune to that, and we just take the statistics as they happen, without looking at those things more in depth. African leaders certainly should have their eyes much more on their own populations, on the problems that their populations face, on the causes for which terrorist organizations are able to thrive in their countries and on the continent, and should be less concerned about the agendas of foreign powers on the continent, because foreign powers come in with the idea of security, but really it's about their own interests. So, for example, opening the door to the United States Africa Command, for example, which is now happening all over the African continent. They've had military exercises even with South Africa. That's not safe. That's a very dangerous move for African governments and African states themselves, and I think we need to be much more careful.
Well, on that note of caution, that's Na'eem Jeenah. He's the Executive Director of the Afro-Middle East Centre.